Up next, we have our very first Bridge Masterclass, How People Learn by Julie Dirksen. This will be moderated by Shreyasi Singh, Harappa's founder and CEO. So over to you, Shreyasi.
Thank you, Nikhil, and I hope all the sessions have been going fun. I believe the one just before this led to lots of conversations and discussions. And I think this one is really, really special to us, especially to me. And I genuinely wanted to moderate this one because we have Julie with us. And Julie is, of course, a learning strategy consultant and an instructional designer, and obviously has consulted with some of the world's leading companies on their learning systems and learning initiatives. But really, it's her book designed for how people learn that is a genuine Bible for learning custodians, learning designers, and educators. And for us, and for me specifically, this session is a way of saying thank you and giving gratitude to Julie, because I think her book has impacted so much of how we think about curriculum and the way that we design curriculum at Harappa. It's the book that, although it actually was gifted to me by Nikhil, I have bought and gifted so much to so often to so many people. And in the early days as a startup 2 years back, it was our orientation. You joined Harappa, we gave you Julie Dirksen's book on design for how people learn, and really to bring you up to speed on how we're thinking about curriculum. So I'm so very excited and so very grateful again to have Julie. And thank you, Julie, for the role that you've played at Harappa. And of course, we hunted her down and in fact met her in the US and got her to consult with us as well. The masterclass will be for 20 minutes and Julie will actually share her slides. So please take notes. I know that there will be lots of learning. And her focus for the masterclass today is how we learn complex skills. So she has a fascinating framework that she's going to unveil and tell us about. And I think we've been talking about all kinds of skills through the sessions that we've been having at the Bridge this afternoon, and all of them are complex skills. Nothing is actually easy to learn. And so this is a very timely session. And as I said, get ready to take notes and learn. I'll be back in 20 minutes as Julie finishes, and we will then obviously take some questions from the audience. So over to you, Julie.
All right, thank you so much. Just bring up. The question that was in the previous session was actually a very nice lead in to this question, which was this question of standardizing proof of work, because I actually think that we probably need to be somewhat careful about how we do tasks like that, where we think about what type of work we're asking for proof of is going to impact kind of how we look at proof, or how we look at evaluation for it, or how we do grading, or any of those kinds of problems. And I'll explain more as we get into this. But for my own practice, I've been really interested in the question lately of complex skills. And one of the big issues with skills is that we require practice for them. That's a very simple idea, right? If it's a skill, you probably need to practice in order to be proficient at it. And yet there's very little in the research literature about how to think about designing deliberate learning experiences for practicing skills, and particularly cognitive skills. And I'll get into that in a moment. So I want to just talk a little bit about the scale question, because I think that's relevant to that sort of standardizing proof of work, and how do we do these things kind of widespread? What do I mean by complex skills? And then there's a particular framework, the Cynefin framework, which I'll talk more about when I get to that point. But and then look at the implications for learning, and specifically learning design. Chris Dede, who's also presenting at this event, has a metaphor that I really like when he talks about scaling ed tech. And he talks about how when we want to scale a solution across a broad number of users or a broad set of problems, it's worth asking what kind of problem or challenge are you working with. And he talks about sleeping, eating, and bonding problems. And a sleeping problem is a problem that has a fairly narrow set of needs. There's just not that much variability. So sleeping, no matter what context or where you are in the world, you need the same set of characteristics. You need warm, safe, dark, quiet, and comfortable. And as long as you have those characteristics, it's going to be a pretty good solution. So if I'm anywhere in the world, as long as I have those things, it's probably okay for sleeping. And so if it's multiplication tables, from an educational point of view, that's a fairly narrow skill. And so pretty much a solution in one place for multiplication tables will probably scale to a large number of users. Eating problems, on the other hand, are problems where the context varies more. And so the right solution is going to depend a little bit. Are you eating breakfast, lunch, or dinner? Are you eating socially? Is it a family event? Is it a social event? Is it a workplace situation? Is your main thing, I just need to get lunch? Or is it, is it something, is it a date? Is it, is it a celebration for something? And the answer to what is a good eating solution is going to depend on the circumstances of the problem. So if the problem is how do you help somebody understand scientific research methods, then what works in one context for one student may not work in another context for another student. But there's probably some similarities, there's probably some commonalities, and as long as everybody gets fed in some context, you're probably okay. Bonding is what's the right answer to how you bond with somebody. And that's really variable depending on context. So how you bond with a coworker is really different than how you bond with a family member, is really different than how you bond with somebody on your sports team, than in how you bond with a romantic partner. And what's appropriate in one circumstance can be really inappropriate in another circumstance. So if you're using it in one case and then trying to move it into another circumstance, it can actually be a hindrance or problem if you're trying to use a single solution too universally. And so this is the metaphor that Chris talks about when he talks about scaling. So we want scale. We want to be able to take a solution that works for a class of 30 and also make it work for an online group of 3,000. But the degree of variability in the problem really is a specific challenge as we try to scale solutions across a wide variety of people. And so this metaphor leads into what I wanted to specifically talk about is how do we design effective solutions for complex skills? And so complex skills, the big characteristics for me are proficiency is required for practice. So they need to, it's going to be something that they need to practice. It involves judgment and decision-making, and I'll talk a little bit more about decision-making environments, and it can be adapted to new contexts. So if I learn this skill in one area, I can adapt it to novel contexts when I encounter them and things like that. And so these are the kinds of things that we're doing. And I wanted to think about specifically this question of practice design, and it exists to a certain extent in some of the medical education literature, like how many cases of a particular thing does somebody need to see in order to be able to start to understand things. We haven't developed it fully in other domains. So if we go over to business schools, for example, we have things like business cases and so forth, but I don't think there's enough knowledge about how many business cases do you need to see about a particular area in order to really start to understand the patterns that are involved. And so this is the stuff that I'm trying to unpack a little bit. And there's a conundrum about practice for complex skills, which is we understand the importance of practice when it's a visible skill and when we can kill people. And what I mean by that is, of course, nobody thinks that you can play. We were just talking about squash and table tennis. Of course, nobody thinks that you can play those things proficiently without practicing. Of course, you need to practice a sport. Music is similar. Of course, you can't be good at music without practicing. We understand that for those kinds of skill domains. And also, nobody would want a doctor who hasn't practiced. Nobody wants a pilot who hasn't practiced. Even driving. I have several friends whose teenage children are going through driver's ed education right now, and I believe the requirement where I live is 60 hours of road practice if you're a teenage driver before you can take the driver's exam. And when I talk about this with groups, I sometimes ask, okay, so 60 hours to practice driving. When they have new managers in their companies or their organizations, how many hours of practice do those managers have before they get turned loose on employees? And the answer is almost none. Maybe a couple hours in a workshop or something like that, then I will always ask the question, is being a manager a less complex task than driving? which one is more complex, driving or managers? And everybody pretty much always agrees that being a manager is a more complex task than driving. And yet we don't think about the need for practice in those environments the same way. And practice is something where you're operating in a safe environment and there's somebody there to provide guidance and feedback as you go through it. So we have this sort of disconnect around the importance of practice when it comes to tasks that are less visible or more cognitive or more internal or any of those kinds of things, where we don't, we might model a few case examples, but we don't practice it any kind of intense way. And I think that that's a big area where we're seeing these kinds of disconnects between people coming out of school and being able to kind of move into the workforce effectively are often environments where there just hasn't been enough practice of kind of key skills in order to be able to transfer academic knowledge into workplace application. The model that I really quite like that's been very helpful for my thinking on this is a model called Cynefin, which is originated by Dave Snowden when he was at IBM in the late 90s and was originally kind of published publicly in the Harvard Business Review in 2007. And he refers to it as a decision-making or a sense-making model, but it looks at kinds of what sorts of challenges are you dealing with, what problems are you trying to solve, what decisions are you making, and talks about these different domains. And he talks about how there's a clear domain. He sometimes has called this simple or obvious, but I think the current term he's using is clear. A complicated domain, a complex domain, and a chaotic domain. And then there's sort of a disorder in the middle, which I think is a different problem, and I'm not going to address that one, but I'll talk about these four main domains. So clear is something where we know the right answer. So if the problem is how to, take blood pressure for medical personnel, then we know we have a set of procedures, we know what the steps are. It's a well-defined problem. We understand the relationship between cause and effect. And we've said, basically, this is how we solve this problem. We've figured out exactly what we want people to do. So we have a really good sense of what the exact defined behavior is that we're looking to have. And so then it just becomes a matter of that person getting enough practice and fluency with the behavior that they can do it. So it might be updating a medical record, or it might be running a hotel breakfast service, or it even might be something like daily plant operations at a factory. I mean, clear doesn't mean that it's like easy. It could be very complex, but we have a very clear definition. We know what good performance looks like. Then we get into complicated, and this is the situation where experts are really the main purveyors of complicated. They're basically people who have seen enough case examples over their careers that they start to know what solutions look like. These are things where there probably is a right answer, but it tends to be complicated. And expertise is gained through repeated exposure and practice. And you can kind of recognize cause and effect by expertise. So for example, if somebody brings a learning problem to me and I start asking questions, I've got kind of a little decision tree in my brain where I'm like, I ask certain questions, and depending on what they say, I discard some solutions, and then I focus in on some others. And so if I do the work, if I do the heavy lifting, I could probably map out my decision tree around what solution I would suggest to a client. But this is because I've been working in online learning for 20 plus years. And so I have all of these models kind of internalized. And so it could be playing chess or medical, the process for medical research, or it could be certain forms of business consulting, those kinds of things. And we can move complicated to clear if we're willing to do the work to map all of these options out. So for example, flight safety is a case where they're trying to reduce error in the system. And so if you learned to fly 100 years ago, you'd go up with a pilot and you'd kind of learn what they do, and you learn it by feel and all of these kinds of things. And you'd sort of, just figure it out by trial and error. But they decided that's not an acceptable level of error for the flight safety system. And so they have managed to externalize all of the guidelines, and you have very thorough and complex guidelines for flying planes, commercial aircraft, because they're trying to minimize absolute error out of the system, because the consequences are so dire when it goes wrong. And so typically that's doable, but it's a very expensive process externalize all of that information. And so we only do it in scenarios where basically lives are at stake. So then complex is the really interesting one, because the world that we're living in, the sort of VUCA world, volatile and uncertain and complex, and I can't remember what the A is right now, is a place where there's not necessarily a lot of right answers and that patterns emerge. So what's the right path to go down for product innovation, or what's the right answer for scaling learning solutions? Well, we can kind of come up with theories and hypotheses, but the honest truth is we're going to have to test it out, figure out what works, try some other things, bring that data back into the system to formulate the next attempt. And so really the skill there is being able to kind of like put experiment out in the world and then analyze the results and then feed that back into the next set of solutions. So for example, and these are, we're dealing with changing and unstable circumstances. So what's the right answer today may not be tomorrow. So for example, if you talk to a product pricing expert who says, here's how much you should charge for your product, they don't actually ever say that. They don't ever say, here, you can't go to them and say, here's a product, what do I charge for it? And they're going to say, $99. They're not going to say that. They're going to say, here's how you test this product in the marketplace. Here's how you do audience analysis. Here's how you do competitor analysis. Here's how you, react to the results of the data that you gather in the world and use it to start to formulate pricing recommendations and things like that. And the answer of how much you should charge for this product could change completely tomorrow because Google comes out with a free version or Amazon's undercutting your pricing. And so there isn't a single answer. There's only a way to basically probe, sense, respond, try it out, sense what's the feedback on it, and then respond to it. And this in particular is a thing where we're seeing this more and more and more in the world that we're doing. And so thinking about kind of what kinds of learning experiences support developing those skills. So it could be design innovation, it could be product pricing, it could be things like executive leadership, like what's the right thing for a CEO to do changes a lot. And there isn't a single right answer that can be prescribed up front. And then chaotic is on the ground after the earthquake hits. Things are completely in disarray, and you're having to do things like triage to establish order, try to pull things back into a more stable situation. And so when we think about learning, things that might be disaster response or cyber attack or global pandemic, we're going to have to operate with incomplete information. And so people need to be able to try to make order in the world so that they can start to get some control over a particular domain and bring it back into one of the other areas is basically the issue with that. And with these, one of the big problems, especially in the workplace world that I spend a lot of my time in, is figuring out how do you give people enough exposure to the stress of these environments so that they have a reasonable form of kind of emotional self-regulation. So if somebody goes into a disaster situation, how do they not kind of lose their minds once we take them out of the academic classroom and put them into a disaster environment, and what kinds of practice or exposure or simulations do they need in order to be able to function in really high stress circumstances. So the implications for learning when we start to think about this is the modality of study is kind of governed somewhat by these. And then a big part of it is evaluation and how do you, again, this sort of question of scaling evaluation. So clear is our easy one, right? It's well suited to self-study often. It can be done with recognition-based evaluation. So, multiple choice inventories, things like that. It can be graded by computer because there's a right answer and we can evaluate whether the student got it or they didn't get it. When we go into complicated, one of the big issues there is how many case examples does somebody need to see in order to be able to start to establish patterns? Anders Ericsson is one of the big researchers in this space. His book Peak is an excellent one if you're interested in this particular question. And one of the things they did when they were training radiologists to read x-rays and so forth is create a massive database of x-ray and outcome data. I think it was like 16,000, because what they wanted to do is if you're an intern radiologist, you maybe see 20 cases a week. Well, can they get you to see 200 cases by practicing with this database? and basically fast forward your exposure to case examples so that you can start to do this kind of pattern recognition much, much, much faster. But when we actually look at performance, you can do some recognition-based evaluation. So for something like reading an X-ray, either get a right or wrong answer, but in other circumstances, it can be a little bit more complex and you need expert instructor grading. And you want people to hopefully perform whatever the skill is so that you can assess whether they're coming up with the right answer. So that's a less scalable evaluation model where we still probably need expert evaluators to give people feedback on things. Complex is really learning a method of inquiry. It really works best if you can do real world practice. So these are workshops where they're going out, doing some kind of practice. When I used to teach project management, all of my students had an actual client project in the real world. They would do stuff for nonprofits where they would go out and do these kinds of things. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to think about, is how is this person practicing the act of doing that probe, sense, respond, where they go out, try something in the real world, come back, practice. And, so then we're getting into either expert grading or critique grading or some possibilities. And then chaotic, it's things like triage procedures, it's emotional self-regulation, as I mentioned. A lot of this comes down to simulation. Can you simulate some of these environments so that people can get comfortable working within them? Triage procedures are actually usually more in the clear domain where we said, here's the right things to do, but they're still going to have to respond to a chaotic environment. A few other variables to consider. Time to acquire. Is this something that fast, medium, slow? I've started having subject matter experts do that assessment for me. How long did it take you to get good at it? Is this a fast, medium, or slow to acquire skill? And those answers have been very helpful when it comes to planning kind of curriculum out. Tacit, explicit. Is it something you learn by tacit means where you get a lot of exposure? Is it something where we have an explicit rule set? Variability of outcomes. There's more right answers to designing a website than there is to taking blood pressure. Taking blood pressure has a narrow range of variability in its outcomes. And so we can pretty much say if somebody's in the right range or not. If somebody designs a website, that's got a much broader range of outcomes that could all be good, but there's just more variability there. And then error tolerance. Obviously, again, things where you can kill people have very small error tolerance. We need to remove error from the system. But an acting program, drama or something like that, has a wider error tolerance than medical, kinds of things. And that's going to govern the sorts of practice and the types of evaluation that you do. So yeah, that's the model that I've been using to kind of help break these things down. And I found it's very helpful because it really does point you in some useful directions. But I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Julie. I think really useful framework. And we're beginning to get some questions, and I'm just going to be seeing them on my WhatsApp. But I have a question for you to begin with, right? I mean, for example, let's take the example of two different skills. At Harappa, for example, we teach skills like negotiation and presence. And for learners from 18 to 40, 18 to 45, how do we even think about that? Do we almost junk theory and only have inquiry-based, practice-based modules? So essentially, instead of curriculum, you're almost building an interactive assessment suite. Is that the way to think about the kind of skills that at least we focus on?
Right. And negotiation is an interesting one. So that's something where I would say there's probably a range from complicated to complex. By the way, it's not like anything ever fits into totally, well, a few things maybe fit into just one single domain, but it's entirely possible that something may bridge a couple of domains. I don't want to give the implication that you only pick one necessarily. So I would say that something like negotiation probably bridges a complex or complicated and complex. And so then when we look at designing for that, I would be looking at the question of how many exposures to case examples. So seeing examples of how negotiations have gone down. So worked examples are something that gets used a lot in the medical, so like, training physicians and things like that. And so I would definitely look at a program of some worked examples around negotiation, and then also complex so that they're doing kind of practice,
Sure.
Whether it's role play or something like that. And so I think because that one sits in there, and that doesn't mean that there aren't still rules or guidelines that you can teach in kind of a clear way, but it does mean that we need to kind of look across a few of the domains to start to think about solutions for it.
Sure. Julie, can I also request you to stop sharing your screen? And there's a request from someone in the audience that we want to see the clear slide again. So to them, we will take a screenshot of the clear slide that you had and be able to share that with you. So you are saying that even examples, for example, if we have to scale learning, and I think that's one of the big concerns from a remote learning, online learning perspective, as well as for large institutions and large enterprises, the scaling learning, or for people like us, using examples from a complex whatever would be very, very useful. So show 10 different kinds of negotiation. Show an example of a negotiation with a different power structure between the two people, negotiation between equals. Is that what would be helpful for learners?
Right. So I was working with a group that was training project managers who were doing budgeting for large electrical installations. So these are the people who would go in and provide the electrical for a office building or a shopping mall or anything like that. And so the process of training their project managers, they had a 2-week kind of upfront thing, and they would work through cases. But I think they had like 2 or 3 cases, which is enough to kind of understand the process of how you budget for something like that. But honestly, the way that you get genuinely good at budgeting is usually through trial and error. You find out what works. But if you're doing 3 projects a year, it takes a long time to get enough trial and error to really understand what some of the budgeting pitfalls are. And so we implemented a program where they would do monthly shares with their people. So one of the experienced project managers would just basically break open a budget that they'd worked on over lunch on a webinar, and say, here's what went well, here's what didn't go well, here's what we learned from this budget. And so then instead of only seeing 3 budgets over the course of a year, you would see 3 plus the additional 12. Now, was that enough? Maybe not. I mean, maybe you'd need even more than that. I'd probably front load more examples, although actually once you start to get a little bit of experience, as exposure to those kinds of things become important. I was also working with a group on their Six Sigma training, and one of the things we found is that after your first Six Sigma project, you're 6 months in, that was a really nice point to add an additional learning intervention, because the person had now had the experience of doing one project from start to finish, and that this was a really good time to kind of level up those skills before they went into their second project at that point, and that they weren't kind of taking advantage of that sort of natural moment to kind of go back and do a refresh on some of the stuff they learned up front, or to look at some more examples before they went into their second one.
I think that's a really great example from an enterprise learning perspective, because we have so many learning custodians in the audience, is to say, take actual artifacts of things that are happening in work, which you said, take actual budgets, right? And somebody in your team has created it, and to use that as an example really helps. There's a question coming in, and I think after that question we'll have to end, is which category in your frameworks, the skeleton framework skills, does mindfulness and presence come under? And how would one even think about scaling a skill like those two?
Yeah. The mindfulness is an interesting one, because the question is, what are we really asking somebody, what's the actual skill when we're applying it? So like I said, there's an emotional self-regulation component to it. So mindfulness is the ability to kind of like bring yourself back down if you're in a stressful environment. Or it could be, about being thoughtful about something before you make a decision, or, whatever. And so pinpointing where the application points are. And then I think that's something that things like sports analogies actually could be really useful for. I sometimes talk about this. I'm like, if we think about basketball camp, or, football camp or something like that, how do they structure a learning experience, and how is that different than the ways we structure learning experiences for cognitive tasks? And so something like mindfulness, I think, is something where you look at things like daily practice and, some scenarios for being able to kind of do it over time, so that you basically grow that muscle. So anything where we kind of need to grow a muscle in order to be able to do it, even if it's cognitive. I think, I've been talking to some people who actually do sports coaching or music education to try to deconstruct some of the practices that they're using and think about how can we bring them into more cognitive domains.
I think that's, again, two really interesting points. Actually, three really interesting points. Think of sports. How do people continuously get better, and apply that even to cognitive skills, like being a manager, being a high potential manager, being a whatever. Second is really, which is the skill that is being applied, because there are behaviors that we expect of mindfulness or having presence, but which is the skill, and at what point is that skill being applied? So I think there are a lot of these deeper questions, but I think for everyone in terms of a takeaway, think about how a sports team would do it, is a good one for us to think about every day. And everyday learning, especially for adults and professionals, is about everyday practice. So practice-oriented muscle building of skills is a key thing. And I think, how do we scale that if you're using an online learning platform of context is the thing to think about. Thank you so much, Julie, to the audience. There is a Padlet link, and we're collecting responses on questions around learning. But thank you, Julie, again for joining us at Harappa Bridge.